Charles Grandison Finney was a Presbyterian minister in the early 1830s whose preaching style was unique for his time. His theology was quite progressive for that era, and he is considered one of the leaders of the Second Great Awakening. His preaching led him to promote various social reforms, including the abolition of slavery and the suffrage of women, giving women the right to vote, along with other equal rights. He valued education and spoke at length about allowing women and African Americans to be educated, along with white men. In 1851, he became president of Oberlin College, the first college in the U.S. to allow women and African Americans both to attend. In 1831, Reverend Finney started a unique and controversial practice. A leader in the revival movement, where folks were inclined to pray out loud and publicly, Finney allowed and encouraged women to pray out loud, along with the men. This was taboo in the 1800s, where women could not vote, hold office, or even speak in public. Women sat separate from men, even in church, with men on one side and women on the other. Reverend Finney was criticized for his progressive political stance, but holding true to the gospel of Jesus Christ, he continued his practice and continued to encourage equal rights for women in all areas of society. This is regarded by historians as the impetus for the women's rights movement of the 1800s and the suffrage movement, of encouraging that women be given the right to vote. In 1832, the next year, William Lloyd Garrison organized an abolitionist movement in Boston that also encouraged full participation of women in all aspects of their work, including public speaking. Women's suffrage was part of their platform as well as the abolition of slavery. These movements in 1831 and 1832 were the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. The encouragement of women in these movements led Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, along with a group of Quaker women, to organize the Seneca Falls Convention of July 1848, the convention that truly galvanized the women's suffrage movement. The result of that convention was the Declaration of Sentiments, insisting that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges that belong to them as citizens of the United States. This women's movement continued to hold annual conventions until the beginning of the Civil War, and after the Civil War grew even stronger. In 1878, what would become the 19th Amendment, eventually, to the U.S. Constitution was introduced to the House of Representatives. The proposed amendment was not approved until 41 years later, May 21st, 1919. And on August 26, 1920, that amendment was approved by 2/3 of the majority of U.S. states, and women's suffrage became law. A full 89 years after Reverend Charles Grandison Finney and his Presbyterian revival meetings, women finally achieved a measure of legal equality. The same is true of the abolitionist movement. There are those who have presumed that the Civil War ended everything. The Emancipation Proclamation brought equality to African Americans, but that's not so. Despite President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the passage of the 13th Amendment back in 1865, which ended slavery, it was not until the passage of the Equal Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that African Americans achieved some measure of equality. Until the passage of that act, the Equal Rights Act of 1964, interracial marriage was still illegal in many states, including Missouri. Even though the Civil War ended in 1865, it took 99 years for interracial marriage to become legal in all 50 states. Now, it would be naive to say that today women and black Americans have full equality. Though their equality is assured and ensconced into our legal system by laws and constitutional amendments, equality is far from a reality. Women are still paid less than men often, and often treated as inferior in the workplace, and held to a double standard in politics. Black Americans, though guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by legislation and constitutional amendments, still do not enjoy the same cultural freedoms and opportunities that other citizens do. The fight for justice is never a quick and easy battle, but historically, even when temporary setbacks occur, in the face of justice, they pay off. So this is the scope of our gospel lesson for today. The parable that Ember read to us about Jesus talking about the widow and the unjust judge. Jesus told this parable to a group of Pharisees who were asking Jesus about the kingdom of God. Pharisees, as a rule, were keepers of the law. Among some of the beliefs held by the Pharisees, they championed an eschatological belief that the current world or the current age is flawed or cursed and would be replaced by a better world or a better age to come. They weren't focused on heaven. This isn't about heaven. They were focused on making earth a heavenly place. This was Jesus' view as well. And this parable was part of a conversation Jesus had in response to a question posed by the Pharisees. When is the kingdom of God coming? That was Luke 17, verse 20, right before the section that Ember read in chapter 18. Right before that, the Pharisees asked of Jesus, when is the kingdom of God coming? And Jesus responds with this parable. In a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for the people. In that city, there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, grant me justice against my opponent. For a while he refused, but she persisted. Finally, he said, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by her persistence. This parable, this odd parable, in response to the question from the Pharisees, when is the kingdom of God coming? How do we hold that question and response in tension? I can imagine that Reverend Charles Grandison Finney back in 1831 must have been criticized as being too political by some when he put forth the outrageous idea that women should be allowed to speak, to serve, to vote. Championing women's rights in a man's world undoubtedly brought him conflict and strife. In the United Church of Christ, we often feel that same criticism when we take stands for justice, and yet we persist. In 2005, the United Church of Christ took a particularly unjust onslaught of criticism from its detractors when we took a stand for marriage equality. Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 allowing interracial marriage, our 2005 marriage equity resolution called for settings of the church to discuss the issue of marriage equality and, if in agreement with the idea, to work on strategies to influence this in local legislatures. Many attacked the United Church of Christ unjustly, claiming that the United Church of Christ had taken too broad a stand for LGBT rights and overstepped cultural propriety, as if this was something new in the UCC. However, the UCC has been doing this since 1969 in the aftermath of the Stonewall riots. Since 1969, many in the United Church of Christ have boldly proclaimed that the LGBTQIA community should be accepted, loved, affirmed, and treated as equal, and that despite what some in culture and religion may claim, God's LGBTQIA children are definitely not broken. In the case of the United Church of Christ, vindication came as the Supreme Court upheld the ruling that marriage equity was the law of the land on June 26, 2015. Now, full equality is still a tenuous thing for that community, but the persistence of those fighting for justice has certainly brought God's kingdom closer to reality. So when is God's kingdom coming? In a certain city, there was an unjust judge and a persistent widow fighting for justice. This is the tension we hold today. Why did Jesus tell this parable in response to the questioning of the Pharisees? Well, we've talked a bit these past few weeks about Jesus' use of parables. Jesus didn't intend parables to be simple moral stories with a convenient lesson at the end. Jesus didn't intend parables to be allegories with roles assigned to each of the characters. Jesus intended parables to be wisdom lessons, designed to make us think. Parables are supposed to get us to think about what the possibilities are if we just allow ourselves to be unbound by the constraints of our culture. If we just allowed ourselves to think kingdom of God thoughts instead of kingdom of humanity thoughts. Parables always have an odd spin or twist to them, and the outcome usually differs from cultural norms and expectations. Today's parable is no exception to that format. You see, in Jesus' day, a woman would not have had much chance at an audience with a judge, much less the ability to persist as this woman did. Certainly a woman would not have questioned the ruling of a judge, her cultural superior in every way. But this woman commits a culturally inappropriate offense, defiance of her superior and persistence in opposition to his ruling. Her community would not have approved of her actions, and the Pharisees who heard Jesus tell this parable would have been shocked. But the twist of the parable, the cultural inappropriateness of it, would have caused the Pharisees and others to stop and think, not only about the answer to the question that Jesus gave, but about the very question itself. When is the kingdom of God coming? They asked. In a certain city, there was an unjust judge and a persistent widow fighting for justice, Jesus answered. Remember, neither Jesus or the Pharisees are talking about heaven here. Jesus says the kingdom of God, talking about life here on earth. Same with the Pharisees. So that's what the Pharisees and Jesus are focused on today. When is the kingdom of God coming? Is like asking, when will this broken world be restored? And this is the context of Jesus' parable. He essentially tells them when justice prevails. But justice is not going to prevail on its own. It takes persistence. That's another part of the wisdom of this parable today. When a disenfranchised widow in a patriarchal society persists against the powerful, privileged judge, justice prevails, and God's kingdom is a bit closer to reality. When Charles Grandison Finney, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton persist against the culture and United States legislature, justice prevails, and God's kingdom is a bit closer to reality. When the leaders of the civil rights movement persist, justice prevails, and God's kingdom is a bit closer to reality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Persistence brings about God's kingdom. So today is Children's Sabbath Sunday. This designation was created by the Children's Defense Fund, a public interest nonprofit started in 1973 to promote the welfare of children. Now, Children's Sabbath Sunday is not just a day to marvel at how cute our children are, to listen to them play bells and say, isn't it a great blessing to have children in our midst? Children's Sabbath Sunday is designed as a day to reflect on justice issues pertaining to children. In all the justice issues we've talked about so far in this sermon, children are often overlooked. Adults argue about the racial, the ethnic, the economic, the environmental, the political, and the social agendas, but children are the ones who are impacted the most. They often have no voice in our arguments, or when they do find their voice, they are disenfranchised by adults. But the reality is that children are the ones most impacted by the decisions we make at every level. And children are the ones who suffer the most when we fail to be as persistent as that widow. Issues of justice are theoretical to the ones who make the decisions, but to children around the world, those issues are matters of life and death. Some of you may be familiar with Reverend Tracy Blackman, our United Church of Christ Associate General Minister. She writes about the traditional greeting of the Maasai culture of East Africa. When meeting one another, as we would say, hi, how you doing? They say, how are the children? And how are the children is their greeting. Their first priority in all decisions and all interactions is how it affects their children. Even warriors with no children of their own give that answer. How are the children? And they say all the children are well, meaning that peace and safety prevail. Protecting the young is most important. All the children are well means God's kingdom is at hand. A few weeks ago, I told you a sobering statistic, and let me expand on that a bit further. According to the World Health Organization, 15,000 children die every day around the world due to complications caused by a lack of access to clean water, adequate nutrition, proper medical care, and vaccines. You can look it up if you don't believe me. 15,000 children each day. So how are the children in our fight for justice? The good news is we're making progress. This number has been cut more than in half since 1990, when that number was 34,000 deaths every day. But like the struggle for racial and gender equality, there's still a long way to go. We must ask ourselves with every decision we make as a society, and how are the children? Maybe an interesting way to look at this parable would be if the Pharisees were to ask, when will this broken world be restored? And Jesus were to answer, and how are the children? Amen.